The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain as Jake Thompson adjusted his worn cowboy hat and squinted at the map spread across his truck's hood. The 42-year-old rancher had been searching for his missing cattle for 3 days now, following their trail deeper into unfamiliar territory than he'd ever ventured before. His weathered hands traced the faded lines on the paper, but nothing seemed to match the landscape stretching endlessly before him. Jake had inherited the Thompson ranch from his father 5 years ago, along with its mounting debts and dwindling herd. Every head of cattle counted toward keeping the bank from foreclosing on the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. These particular steers represented nearly a quarter of his remaining livestock, and losing them would mean losing everything he'd worked his entire life to preserve. The drought had been merciless that summer, forcing the cattle to wander farther from the ranch in search of water and decent grazing. Jake understood their desperation. His own water wells were running dangerously low, and the grass on his property had turned brown and brittle weeks ago. But understanding didn't make the situation any less dire. As he folded the map and climbed back into his pickup truck, Jake noticed storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The irony wasn't lost on him that rain might finally come just as he was about to lose his ranch. He'd always been a practical man, not given to dwelling on life's cruel jokes, but lately everything seemed to be working against him. The truck bounced and lurched over the rocky ground as Jake followed what he hoped were fresh cattle tracks. The landscape grew increasingly strange and beautiful as he drove deeper into the wilderness. Towering red rock formations jutted up from the earth like ancient sentinels, and the air seemed to shimmer with an almost otherworldly quality. Despite his pressing concerns, Jake found himself momentarily captivated by the raw majesty of the place. Hours passed as he navigated through narrow canyons and across dried creek beds. The cattle tracks seemed to lead him in circles, and Jake began to suspect he was more lost than he cared to admit. His radio crackled with static whenever he tried to call his ranch hand, Pete, and his cell phone showed no signal bars. The fuel gauge was dropping steadily, adding another layer of worry to his already complicated situation. Just as Jake was considering turning back and admitting defeat, he spotted something that made his heart leap with hope. Fresh hoofprints in a patch of soft earth, clearly made by cattle and heading in a definite direction. He pressed harder on the accelerator, following the trail as it wound through a series of increasingly narrow passages between towering rock walls. The passage eventually opened into a circular valley unlike anything Jake had ever seen. The grass here was green and lush, fed by a clear stream that meandered through the center of the hidden oasis. Ancient petroglyphs covered the rock walls, their mysterious symbols seeming to watch over the peaceful scene. And there, grazing contentedly near the water, were his missing cattle. Jake parked his truck and stepped out, relief flooding through him as he counted the animals. They were all there, looking healthier than they had in months thanks to the abundant grass and fresh water. But as he walked toward them, something about the place made him pause. There was a quality to the silence that felt different from ordinary, quiet, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. The petroglyphs drew his attention again, and Jake found himself walking closer to examine them. He'd never been particularly interested in Indian history or archaeology, but there was something compelling about the ancient artwork. The symbols seemed to tell a story, though he couldn't begin to interpret their meaning. Some depicted animals he recognized, deer, birds, and what looked like cattle. Others showed human figures engaged in activities that remained mysterious to his untrained eye. As Jake studied the rock art, he became aware of a sound that didn't belong to the natural symphony of the valley. Footsteps on stone, deliberate and approaching. He turned around quickly, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle in his truck, but stopped short when he saw who was walking toward him. A Native American woman emerged from behind one of the larger rock formations, moving with a grace and confidence that immediately commanded respect. She appeared to be in her 30s, with long black hair braided down her back and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything about Jake and his situation with a single glance. Her clothing was modern but practical, jeans, boots, and a simple, cotton shirt, yet she carried herself with a dignity that suggested deep cultural roots. Jake removed his hat, a gesture of respect his father had drilled into him from childhood. The woman approached without apparent fear or hostility, though her expression was serious and unreadable. When she was close enough to speak without raising her voice, she stopped and regarded him with those penetrating dark eyes. "You're lost," she said simply, and it wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose I am," Jake replied, surprised by how easily he admitted it to this stranger. There was something about her presence that made him want to be honest. "I was tracking my cattle. They wandered off during the drought and I've been searching for 3 days. The woman glanced toward his grazing livestock, then back at him. Her expression softened slightly, though she remained watchful. "They found good grass and water, smart animals." "Smarter than their owner, apparently," Jake said with a rueful smile. "I'm Jake Thompson. I run a ranch about—" He paused, realizing he had no idea how far he'd traveled or in which direction. "Well, somewhere back that way." "I know who you are," the woman said, which surprised him. "Your cattle aren't the first to find their way here during dry years. I'm Elena Crowfeather. This is sacred land belonging to my people." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Sacred land. He'd heard stories about such places, about the legal protections they carried and the serious consequences for trespassing. His mind immediately went to worst-case scenarios. Arrest, fines he couldn't afford, additional legal troubles on top of his existing financial problems. "I didn't know," he said quickly. "I was just following my cattle. I'll gather them up right now and get out of your way. I apologize for the intrusion." Elena studied him for a long moment, and Jake found himself hoping desperately that she would believe him. He'd always tried to be respectful of others, regardless of their background, but he'd never found himself in a situation quite like this one. The last thing he wanted was to offend this woman or her people, especially when he was clearly the one in the wrong. The wind picked up, rustling the grass and carrying with it the scent of coming rain. Jake glanced at the darkening sky, then back at Elena, waiting for her response and wondering how this unexpected encounter would change the course of his already complicated day. Elena Crowfeather watched the genuine distress in Jake's eyes and felt something unexpected stir within her. She'd encountered many trespassers on tribal land over the years, and most fell into predictable categories. There were the thrill seekers, looking for adventure, the treasure hunters hoping to find artifacts, and the developers scouting for potential projects. But Jake Thompson seemed different. His concern appeared authentic, and his respect for her and the situation was evident in his body language. The first drops of rain began to fall, creating small dark circles on the dusty ground around them. Elena glanced up at the rapidly darkening sky, then made a decision that surprised even herself. "The storm will be here soon," she said calmly. "It's not safe to try driving out of the canyon in heavy rain. The washes flood quickly here, and people have died trying to outrun flash floods." Jake looked torn between his desire to leave immediately and his growing awareness of the dangerous weather conditions. He'd lived in this country long enough to know that flash floods were nothing to take lightly. The narrow passages he'd driven through to reach this valley would become death traps if the water rose. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice betraying his uncertainty. Elena pointed toward a large overhang in the rock wall, where the ancient petroglyphs were most densely concentrated. "There's shelter there. Your cattle will be safe in this valley during the storm. They know enough to move to higher ground if needed." Jake hesitated, acutely aware that accepting her offer would mean staying longer on sacred land. But as the rain began to fall more steadily, practical concerns overrode his discomfort. He nodded gratefully and jogged back to his truck to gather his supplies and move the vehicle to a more protected spot. Under the rock overhang, Elena had already started a small fire using dry wood that had been carefully stored in the shelter. The flames cast dancing shadows on the petroglyphs above them, bringing the ancient artwork to vivid life. Jake couldn't help but stare at the images, fascinated by their timeless quality. "How old are these?" he asked, settling onto a flat rock near the fire.
"Some are over 1,000 years old," Elena replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone who'd told this story many times before. "Others are much newer, My great-grandmother added some of these symbols when she was a young woman.
Jake's eyes widened. Your great-grandmother? She was an artist? She was many things, Elena said with a smile that transformed her serious face. Artist, healer, keeper of stories, and according to my grandfather, the most stubborn woman who ever lived. She insisted on documenting changes to the land and our people's experiences, even when others thought it was unnecessary. Outside their shelter, the storm intensified dramatically. Rain poured down in sheets and thunder echoed through the canyon with a deep, resonant boom that seemed to come from the earth itself. Jake watched Elena's face in the firelight, noting how the harsh angles of her features softened when she spoke about her family. What kind of changes did she document? Jake found himself asking, genuinely curious despite everything else on his mind. Elena stood and moved closer to one section of the rock wall, pointing to a series of symbols that looked more recent than the others. See these? They show the coming of cattle ranchers to this area, and these represent the railroad. She wanted future generations to understand how the land and its use evolved over time. Jake studied the symbols she indicated, amazed that he could actually recognize some of the images now that she'd explained them. Cattle, horses, even what looked like railroad tracks were clearly depicted among the more traditional hunting and ceremonial scenes. She sounds like she was remarkable, he said softly. She was, Elena agreed, settling back down across from him. She's also the reason I'm here talking to you instead of calling the tribal police. The statement hung in the air between them, and Jake felt his stomach tighten with anxiety. What do you mean? Elena poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up toward the rock ceiling. My great-grandmother used to say that the land brings people together for a reason. She believed that when someone found their way to this place, especially during times of trouble, it was because they needed to be here. Times of trouble? Jake repeated, wondering how much this woman could possibly know about his situation. A man doesn't track cattle for 3 days into unfamiliar territory unless he's desperate, Elena observed quietly. And desperate people don't usually take time to remove their hats and apologize for accidentally trespassing on sacred land. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks, though whether from embarrassment at being so easily read or appreciation for her perceptiveness, he wasn't sure. You're very observant. It's part of my job, Elena said. I'm the cultural liaison between my tribe and various government agencies. I spend a lot of time reading people and situations. The rain continued to drum against the rock overhang, creating a curtain of water that completely obscured their view of the valley beyond. In the warm, dry space they shared, Jake found himself relaxing despite the unusual circumstances. There was something about Elena's presence that felt reassuring rather than threatening. Can I ask you something? Jake said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. You can ask, Elena replied with a slight smile that suggested she might not answer. Why are you being so kind to me? I mean, I'm trespassing on your sacred land, and you're treating me like a guest. Elena was quiet for so long that Jake began to think she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful and measured. My people have lived on this land for countless generations. We've seen many changes, faced many challenges. Some outsiders have brought great harm to us and our way of life, but others— She paused, searching for the right words. Others have proven to be allies and friends when we needed them most. She turned to look directly at him, and Jake felt the full weight of her intelligence and strength in that gaze. I don't know yet which kind of person you are, Jake Thompson, but I'm willing to find out. The honesty of her statement struck him deeply. Here was a woman who had every right to be suspicious of him, every reason to view him as a threat or an enemy, and yet she was approaching their encounter with an open mind and heart. It was more generosity than he felt he deserved, and certainly more than he'd expected to receive. Thunder crashed overhead again, so close that they both felt the vibration in the rock beneath them. Jake instinctively moved closer to the fire and found himself sitting nearer to Elena as well. In the flickering light, surrounded by the artwork of her ancestors and the sound of the storm, he felt as if he'd been transported to another world entirely. Tell me about your ranch, Elena said suddenly, breaking the spell that had settled over them. Jake laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. What's left of it, you mean? There's not much to tell that would interest someone like you. Try. Me, Elena said simply. And so, as the storm raged outside their ancient shelter, Jake found himself opening up to this remarkable woman about his struggles, his fears, and his desperate hope to save the land that meant everything to him. As Jake spoke about his ranch, Elena listened with an attention that went beyond mere politeness. She heard the love in his voice when he described the rolling hills where his grandfather had first built their home, and the pain when he explained how drought and debt were slowly strangling everything his family had worked to create. The firelight played across his weathered features as he talked, revealing a man who carried his burdens with quiet dignity. My father always said the land would provide, Jake concluded, staring into the flames. But I'm starting to think maybe the land is trying to tell me something different now. Elena had been raised with deep respect for the relationship between people and the earth they lived on. In her culture, the land wasn't something to be owned or conquered, but rather something to be understood and worked with. Listening to Jake's story, she could hear echoes of her own people's struggles to maintain their connection to the places that had sustained them for generations. What do you think it's trying to tell you? She asked softly. Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. Honestly, I don't know. Maybe that I'm not cut out for this. Maybe that it's time to accept defeat and move on. Or, maybe, Elena said carefully, it's trying to teach you something you need to learn. The rain began to ease outside their shelter. Though distant thunder suggested the storm was far from over, Elena stood and walked to the edge of the overhang, looking out at the valley where Jake's cattle were weathering the downpour with the patient endurance of animals who understood natural rhythms. Can I show you something? She asked, turning back to him. Jake nodded, curious about what she wanted to share. Elena moved to a different section of the rock wall, where the petroglyphs seemed to tell a sequential story. She pointed to the first image, which showed human figures standing around what appeared to be a dried riverbed. This records a great drought that happened about 300 years ago, she explained. My people were facing starvation. The traditional hunting grounds were empty, the rivers had stopped flowing, and many wanted to abandon this area entirely. Jake stood and joined her, studying the ancient artwork with new interest. The next image showed the same human figures, but now they were kneeling beside small plants or seedlings. Instead of leaving, they decided to learn, Elena continued. They studied which plants could survive with little water, which animals adapted best to changing conditions, and how to work with the land's natural cycles rather than against them. The final image in the sequence showed a flourishing community surrounded by gardens and healthy wildlife. Jake could see the clear message of adaptation and perseverance, but he wasn't sure how it applied to his situation. It's a beautiful story, he said genuinely. But I'm not sure I understand how it helps me save my ranch. Elena turned to face him directly. What if saving your ranch doesn't mean doing things the same way your father and grandfather did? What if it means learning to do them differently? The question hung in the air between them, challenging assumptions Jake had never thought to examine. He'd always believed that honoring his family's legacy meant maintaining their exact methods and traditions. The possibility that innovation might be more respectful than imitation had never occurred to him. I wouldn't even know where to start, he admitted. You've already started, Elena replied with a slight smile. You followed your cattle to water and good grass. They showed you something your existing land couldn't provide. Jake looked out at his grazing animals, seeing them with new eyes. They hadn't wandered off randomly or carelessly. They'd made intelligent decisions based on their needs, leading him to resources he hadn't known existed. But this isn't my land, he pointed out. I can't graze my cattle here permanently. No, Elena agreed. But you could learn from what makes this place work and apply those lessons to your own property. The storm was moving away now, leaving behind the clean, fresh scent of rain-washed earth. Elena suggested they walk out into the valley to check on the cattle and see how the land had responded to the much-needed moisture. Jake was amazed by the transformation. The stream ran fuller and clearer, And even in the short time since the rain had started, he could see new growth beginning to emerge from the previously parched ground. The grass here stays green even during drought years, Elena explained as they walked. Do you know why? Jake examined the vegetation more closely, noting varieties he didn't recognize from his own property. Different types of plants? Partly, Elena confirmed, but also different management. This valley hasn't been overgrazed. The native plants have deep root systems that can access groundwater even when surface moisture is scarce. And look at how the stream flows. She led him to several points along the water's path, showing him natural barriers that slowed the current and allowed water to soak into the ground rather than rushing away. Small dams created by beaver activity and fallen logs had formed a series of pools that supported diverse plant and animal life. Your cattle found this place because they needed what it offers, Elena said. But they also brought you here because you needed to see it. Jake felt something shifting in his understanding, like pieces of a puzzle beginning to fit together in a new way. You really believe that? That there was a purpose to all this? My great-grandmother would have said the spirits of the land were teaching you, Elena replied. But even if you prefer a more practical explanation, you can't deny that being here has given you new information. They spent the next hour exploring the valley together, with Elena pointing out features that contributed to its resilience and productivity. Jake found himself taking mental notes about plant varieties, water management techniques, and grazing patterns that might be adapted to his own land. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely hopeful about finding solutions to his problems. As the sun broke through the dissipating clouds, casting rainbow colors through the lingering mist, Jake realized something profound had happened during their conversation. Elena hadn't just shown him agricultural techniques or land management strategies. She'd helped him see his situation from an entirely different perspective. I need to ask you something, Jake said as they walked back toward their shelter. And please be honest with me. Elena nodded, waiting for his question. Do you think there's really a chance I could save my ranch? Not just delay the inevitable, but actually turn things around? Elena stopped walking and considered his question carefully. When she answered, her voice carried absolute conviction. Think, she said slowly, that a man who would track his cattle for 3 days through unknown territory, who removes his hat to show respect to a stranger, and who listens with an open mind to new ideas, has exactly the qualities needed to overcome difficult challenges. Jake felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. For the first time since inheriting the ranch, he wasn't thinking about what he might lose, but about what he might be able to build. The afternoon was growing late, and Jake knew he needed to start thinking about getting his cattle home before dark. But as he looked around the sacred valley that had sheltered them both from the storm, he realized he didn't want this encounter to end. Elena had given him more than practical advice or agricultural insights. She'd restored his faith in possibilities he'd stopped believing in. Elena, he said quietly, thank you for everything. This conversation has meant more to me than you probably realize. She smiled, and Jake thought it was the most beautiful thing he'd seen in a very long time. The conversation doesn't have to end here, Jake Thompson, she said. If you're serious about learning new ways to work with your land, I might be able to help you. The offer to help caught Jake completely off guard. He studied Elena's face, searching for any sign that she was merely being polite or that he'd misunderstood her meaning. But her dark eyes held steady confidence, and he sensed she didn't make offers lightly. You'd really do that? He asked, hardly daring to believe it. Help me with my ranch? I'd be willing to take a look at your property and share what I know about sustainable land management, Elena replied carefully. My tribe has been developing partnerships with local farmers and ranchers who are interested in traditional ecological practices. It benefits everyone when the land is healthy. Jake felt a surge of excitement mixed with nervous apprehension. The idea of having Elena's expertise and guidance seemed almost too good to be true. But he also worried about what such an arrangement might entail. He'd never worked closely with anyone from the local tribes, and he didn't want to inadvertently offend or disappoint her. What would that involve exactly? He asked. Elena gathered her long braid over one shoulder, a gesture Jake was beginning to recognize as something she did when thinking carefully about her words. First, I'd need to see your land and understand what you're working with. Then, we could develop a plan that combines your family's knowledge of the property with traditional methods that have sustained this region for generations. The sun was getting lower in the sky, and Jake knew he needed to start moving his cattle soon if he hoped to get them home before dark. But the prospect of extending his relationship with this remarkable woman made him reluctant to leave. When could you come out to the ranch? He asked. Tomorrow afternoon, if that works for you, Elena replied without hesitation. I finish my morning meetings with the tribal council by noon most days. Jake couldn't suppress a grin at her quick response. That would be perfect. I'll give you directions before I head out with the cattle. As they worked together to gather his animals and prepare for the journey home, Jake found himself marveling at how dramatically his day had changed. He'd started the morning facing the possible loss of everything he held dear, feeling completely alone in his struggles. Now he had a potential ally, someone with knowledge and skills that might make all the difference in his fight to save the ranch. Elena proved surprisingly helpful with the cattle, displaying an easy familiarity with livestock that impressed Jake. She'd grown up around horses and had worked with various animals throughout her life, though she admitted that cattle ranching wasn't her area of expertise. My grandfather always said that if you understand one four-legged creature, you can learn to understand them all, she explained as she helped guide a stubborn steer toward the group. They all want the same basic things: food, water, safety, and to be treated with respect. The drive back to Jake's ranch took nearly 2 hours, following established roads that were much easier to navigate than the rough terrain he'd covered while tracking the lost cattle. Elena followed in her own vehicle, a practical pickup truck that looked well suited to the demands of her work. During the journey, Jake found himself checking his rearview mirror frequently, still somewhat amazed that she was actually coming to see his property. When they reached the Thompson ranch, Jake saw it through Elena's eyes and felt a mix of pride and embarrassment. The main house was solid and well-maintained, built by his grandfather with careful attention to quality and durability. The barns and outbuildings showed signs of age but had been kept in good repair. However, the effects of the drought were evident everywhere: in the brown grass, the low water levels in the stock tanks, and the general air of struggle that seemed to hang over the entire operation. Elena parked her truck near the house and stepped out, taking in the scene with the same careful attention she'd shown in the Sacred Valley. Jake watched nervously as she surveyed his land, wondering what judgment she was forming about his stewardship of the family property. "This is beautiful country," she said finally, and Jake could hear genuine appreciation in her voice. "Your family chose their location well." The comment eased some of his anxiety, and Jake found himself standing straighter as he began pointing out various features of the ranch. He showed her the original homestead buildings, explained the layout of the grazing areas, and described the water sources that had sustained the operation for decades. Elena asked thoughtful questions about everything from soil types to seasonal weather patterns, and Jake was impressed by how quickly she grasped the complexities of his operation. She had a way of listening that made him feel heard and understood, something he hadn't experienced in far too long. As the evening light began to fade, Jake realized they'd been talking for hours. Elena had filled several pages of a small notebook with observations and ideas, and Jake's initial nervousness had transformed into genuine excitement about the possibilities they discussed. "I should let you get back to your family," Jake said reluctantly, though he couldn't remember Elena mentioning a husband or children. "No family waiting for me," Elena replied matter-of-factly. "My work keeps me pretty busy, and I haven't met anyone who understands why I spend my weekends documenting traditional plant use or mapping historical water sources." The admission revealed a loneliness that Jake recognized all too well. He'd been so focused on saving his ranch that he'd largely isolated himself from social connections, turning down invitations and avoiding community events where people might ask difficult questions about his financial situation. "Would you like to stay for dinner?" he heard himself asking, surprising them both with the spontaneous invitation. "It's not much, just whatever I can put together from what's in the kitchen, but I'd enjoy the company." Elena smiled, And Jake felt warmth spread through his chest at her obvious pleasure in being asked. I'd like that very much. Jake's kitchen was functional rather than fancy, but he took pride in his ability to prepare simple, satisfying meals. As he cooked, Elena sat at the worn wooden table and continued taking notes, occasionally asking questions about the ranch's history or his family's traditional practices. Your great-grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Jake said, as he set plates on the table. I wish I could have met her. She would have liked you, Elena replied with certainty. She always said you could judge a person's character by how they treated the land and animals in their care. Everything I've seen today tells me you're someone she would have respected. The simple meal of steak, potatoes, and vegetables from Jake's struggling garden tasted better than any restaurant dinner he could remember. The conversation flowed easily between them, covering topics from childhood memories to future dreams, and Jake found himself sharing stories and feelings he hadn't expressed to anyone in years. As the evening wound down, Elena gathered her notes and prepared to leave. At the door, she turned to Jake with an expression of determined optimism that made his heart skip a beat. I'll be back tomorrow afternoon with some ideas and possibly a few people who can help us get started on improving your water management, she said. But Jake, I want you to understand something important. What's that? Elena's dark eyes held his steadily, and when she spoke, her words carried the weight of absolute conviction. What we're going to do together isn't just about saving your ranch. It's about creating something better than what existed before. Your land has the potential to become a model for how traditional wisdom and modern needs can work together. Are you ready for that kind of change? Jake thought about her question for only a moment before nodding firmly. I'm ready, he said, and meant it completely. As Elena's truck disappeared into the darkness, Jake stood on his porch looking out at his land with new eyes. For the first time in months, the future seemed full of possibility rather than dread. Elena arrived the next afternoon with two companions who immediately impressed Jake with their quiet competence. Thomas Whitehawk was an elderly man whose weathered hands spoke of a lifetime working with the land, while his daughter Sarah combined her father's traditional knowledge with a degree in environmental science from the state university. Together they represented exactly the kind of bridge between old wisdom and new applications that Elena had promised. Before we make any recommendations, Thomas said in his measured way, we need to understand what the land is telling us. Jake watched in fascination as the three of them moved across his property with focused attention, examining soil conditions, plant life, and water flow patterns with an intensity he'd never seen before. They spoke quietly among themselves, sometimes in English and sometimes in their native language, pointing out details that would have been invisible to Jake's untrained eye. Sarah knelt beside one of Jake's struggling stock ponds, taking water, samples, and making notes about the surrounding vegetation. The water quality is still good, she reported, but the pond is losing moisture faster than it should. The problem isn't just the drought, it's the way water moves across the landscape. Thomas nodded approvingly at his daughter's assessment, before turning to Jake. Your grandfather and father were good ranchers, but they were working with the knowledge available in their time. We understand things about water and soil now that weren't common knowledge 50 years ago. Elena had been studying the area around Jake's main house, paying particular attention to the natural slope of the land and the placement of the various buildings. Jake, can you show us where your family traditionally got their water during dry years? Jake led them to an old well site that hadn't been used in decades, covered now by a weathered wooden platform. His grandfather had mentioned it occasionally, but Jake had never paid much attention to the stories about the reliable water source that had sustained the earliest settlers on the property. We stopped using this when the newer well was drilled closer to the house, when Jake explained. Dad always said the water table had dropped too much for the old well to be practical. Thomas examined the covered well with obvious interest, then walked in expanding circles around the site, studying the ground with the focused attention of someone reading a complex story. Finally, he beckoned the others over to a spot about 50 yards from the original wellhead. The water didn't disappear, he announced with quiet confidence. It moved. The water table shifts over time, especially during extended dry periods. But if we understand the natural flow, we can work with it instead of against it. Sarah had been taking measurements and making calculations on a tablet computer. Dad's right. The geological survey data shows underground water movement that follows the natural contours of the land. We could access that water source, but more importantly, we could help direct surface water to recharge it. Jake felt a familiar mixture of hope and skepticism. These people clearly knew what they were talking about, but he'd heard promises before from experts who'd ultimately delivered little more than expensive disappointment. What would that involve? He asked carefully. Elena stepped forward, her notebook filled with diagrams and observations from their morning exploration, a combination of traditional techniques and modern applications. We'd create a series of small check dams and swales that would slow surface runoff and allow it to soak into the ground instead of flowing away. The idea is to work with natural water patterns instead of trying to fight them. Thomas nodded approvingly. Your cattle showed you the way when they found that sacred valley. They followed water and good grass. We can create similar conditions here, but it will take time and patience. Over the next several hours, the group developed a comprehensive plan that addressed not just water management, but soil health, grazing, rotation, and even the selection of plant varieties that could thrive in changing climate conditions. Jake found himself taking furious notes, trying to capture not just the specific recommendations, but the underlying principles that tied everything together. The most important thing to understand, Sarah explained as they finished their assessment, is that this isn't about imposing solutions on the land. It's about creating conditions where natural systems can function more effectively. As the afternoon progressed, Jake began to see his property through completely different eyes. What he'd always viewed as fixed features of the landscape, hills, gullies, natural meadows, were actually part of. 6 months later, Jake stood on the same hill where he'd once contemplated losing everything, but the view before him had transformed dramatically. The pilot area that Elena's team had helped him develop was thriving beyond their most optimistic projections. Green grass grew thick and healthy where brown stubble had once struggled to survive, and the series of small ponds they'd created sparkled in the morning sunlight, supporting not just his cattle, but an amazing variety of wildlife. The changes went far beyond the physical improvements to the land. Jake had become something of a local celebrity in sustainable agriculture circles, hosting his third educational workshop that month for ranchers from across the region. His story of near bankruptcy transformed into regenerative success had inspired dozens of other operations to consider similar approaches. The October group from the State University is confirmed for next week, Elena said, consulting the tablet, where she kept track of their increasingly busy schedule, 35 students and 5 professors. They specifically want to see the water retention systems and the native grass restoration. Jake smiled as he watched her efficient management of what had become a thriving educational enterprise. Elena had moved into a small cabin on his property 3 months earlier, officially to help coordinate the growing number of visitors and workshops, but their relationship had evolved into something much deeper and more personal than a professional partnership. Remember when you were worried about having enough time to see results? Elena teased, noting his expression of amazement as he surveyed the transformed landscape. I remember thinking 3 years seemed impossible, Jake replied. I never imagined we'd have results this dramatic in half that time. The financial transformation had been just as remarkable as the environmental improvements. Income from the educational programs combined with increased productivity from his healthier grasslands had allowed Jake to pay off his most pressing debts and begin building a substantial emergency fund. The bank that had once threatened foreclosure was now using his ranch as an example of innovative agriculture in their marketing materials. Thomas approached from the direction of the newest project area, where they were implementing an ambitious plan to restore a natural wetland that had been drained decades earlier. At 73, he showed no signs of slowing down, and his enthusiasm for each new challenge inspired everyone around him. The ducks are back, he announced with obvious satisfaction. Haven't seen mallards in this valley for 15 years, but there were 6 pairs on the pond this morning. Sarah emerged from behind a stand of newly planted native trees, her hair tied back and her clothes dusty from a morning spent monitoring soil conditions. "The carbon sequestration data is exceeding all our projections," she reported. "If these trends continue, Jake's operation could become carbon negative within 2 years." The possibility of actually removing more carbon from the atmosphere than his ranch produced had seemed like science fiction when Sarah first explained it. Now, with hard data supporting the theory, Jake was beginning to understand that their small pilot project might have implications far beyond his personal financial recovery. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elena said, her tone suggesting importance. "I received a call yesterday from the Department of Agriculture. They want to include our project in a new federal program supporting climate-friendly farming practices." Jake looked up from the notebook where he'd been recording Thomas's duck observations. "What kind of program?" "Significant funding for operations that can demonstrate measurable environmental benefits," Elena explained. "Carbon sequestration, water conservation, biodiversity enhancement. Based on our documentation, they think this ranch could qualify for substantial support." The irony wasn't lost on Jake that the same federal government whose regulations had once seemed like obstacles to his family's traditional ranching methods was now eager to support their innovative approaches. But more than the potential financial benefits, he was excited about the opportunity to influence policy and help other struggling ranchers access similar resources. What would we need to do? Sarah pulled out her ever-present tablet and began scrolling through technical requirements. Continued monitoring and documentation, which we're already doing. Participation in research studies, which actually fits perfectly with our educational mission. And commitment to maintaining the sustainable practices for at least 10 years. 10 years, Jake repeated, testing how the timeline felt. A year ago, he'd been struggling to imagine surviving 10 more months. Now the idea of a decade-long commitment to building something meaningful felt like exactly the kind of legacy he wanted to create. Elena moved closer to him, and Jake felt the familiar warmth that her presence always brought. Their relationship had developed slowly and naturally, growing from mutual respect and shared purpose into something deeper and more lasting than either had expected to find. "There's one more thing," Elena said quietly. "The Tribal Council has asked if we'd be willing to expand our educational programs to include cultural components. Teaching about traditional ecological knowledge alongside the practical applications." Jake considered the proposal, thinking about everything he'd learned from Thomas and Sarah about the deep connections between cultural wisdom and environmental stewardship. "You mean like what your great-grandmother did with the petroglyphs?" "Exactly like that," Elena confirmed with a smile that lit up her entire face. "Creating a record that preserves knowledge for future generations while helping people understand how traditional practices can address modern challenges." Thomas had been listening to their conversation with the patient attention that Jake had learned to recognize as a sign of his approval. "My granddaughter is studying environmental law," he said thoughtfully. "She's been looking for a project that combines legal advocacy with traditional knowledge preservation. This might be perfect for her dissertation research." The possibility of their small ranch becoming the center of an expanding network of research, education, and policy development excited Jake more than any purely financial success could have. He'd started this journey simply trying to save his family's land, but somewhere along the way it had become about something much larger and more important. As afternoon faded into evening, the group gathered on Jake's porch to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The sounds of the healthy land surrounded them, cattle moving contentedly to evening pastures, birds settling into roosts, water flowing steadily in the restored stream beds. "You know what strikes me most about all this?" Jake said, gesturing toward the transformed landscape. "A year ago, I thought the land was trying to tell me I was failing, but it was actually trying to tell me I needed to change." Elena leaned against his shoulder, her presence as natural and comfortable as breathing. "The land doesn't judge success and failure the way we do. It just responds to how we treat it." Thomas nodded approvingly. "My grandfather used to say that the earth is always teaching, but only some people remember how to listen." Sarah looked up from her tablet, where she'd been reviewing data from their various monitoring stations. "Speaking of listening to the land, the soil microbiology results came back today," The bacterial diversity in our restored areas is now twice what it was in the original samples. Jake smiled at how seamlessly technical data had become part of their everyday conversations. He'd never imagined he'd be genuinely excited about soil bacteria or carbon sequestration rates, but Elena and her team had helped him understand that these seemingly abstract measurements represented the fundamental health of his land. "I have something I want to share with all of you," Jake said, reaching into his shirt pocket for a folded paper. "I've been working on this for a few weeks, trying to find the right words." He unfolded a letter addressed to his late father, explaining everything that had happened since that desperate morning when he'd tracked his cattle into unknown territory. The letter described his initial fears, his encounter with Elena in the Sacred Valley, and the remarkable transformation that had followed. "I wanted him to understand that honoring his legacy didn't mean doing everything exactly the way he did," Jake explained as he finished reading. "It meant caring about the land and the future as much as he did, but using the best knowledge available to us now." Elena wiped tears from her eyes, moved by the obvious love and respect in Jake's words. Thomas and Sarah sat in respectful silence, understanding the significance of this moment for Jake's personal healing, as well as his professional success. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake felt a deep sense of completion and anticipation. The scared, desperate man who had stumbled into sacred land by mistake had been transformed by the experience just as dramatically as his ranch had been transformed by new approaches to stewardship. "So, what's next?" Sarah asked, always eager to plan the next phase of their expanding project. Jake looked around at these remarkable people who had become not just colleagues but family, then out at the land that had taught him so much about resilience, adaptation, and hope. "Everything," he said with quiet confidence. "We're going to do everything."